The moment Captain Victor Vulkoff lit the afterburners, he knew something was terribly wrong. A violent shudder tore through the airframe. The thrust came on unevenly, trying to twist the aircraft sideways, and underneath the roar of the engines there was a sound that made his blood run cold. A roughness. A vibration in frequencies that should not exist in a properly built machine. This was supposed to be China's pride. Their first supersonic fighter, the Shenyang J-6. A copy of his beloved Mining, the aircraft he had flown thousands of hours back home in the Soviet Union. But to Victor's trained ear, these engines sounded like machines waiting to kill their pilot. He pulled back the throttles, and the shuddering subsided. But the damage to his assessment was already done. In that moment, at 25,000 feet over northeastern China, Victor Vulkoff had discovered what Soviet intelligence had sent him to find out. China's attempt to copy Soviet technology had gone catastrophically wrong. The year was 1963, and this is the story of how the dream of Chinese aviation nearly dawned, how its failures would eventually give birth to one of the world's greatest aerospace powers. General Dmitry Sokolov spread the reconnaissance photographs across his desk and frowned. The images showed the Shenyang aircraft factory in northeastern China, rows of silver aircraft lined up on the tarmac, their swept wings gleaming in the winter sun. "They claim they're producing 40 aircraft per month," said Colonel Petrov, standing at attention across the desk. Claims Sokolov lit a cigarette. "The Chinese have been making claims since the Great Leap Forward. What I want to know is whether any of these machines can actually fly." "That's the problem, General. We don't know." 3 years had passed since Moscow had pulled its advisors out of China. 3 years of silence, of uncertainty, of intelligence reports that contradicted each other. Some said the Chinese program had collapsed entirely. Others claimed Beijing was producing fighters at an astonishing rate. The truth, as always in the world of espionage, was hidden somewhere in between. "I need a pilot," Sokolov said finally. "Someone who knows the MiG-19 better than he knows his own wife. Someone who can climb into one of these Chinese copies and tell me exactly what we're dealing with." Petrov nodded. "I have a name. Captain Victor Vulkoff. Test pilot, 3rd Evaluation Squadron. He's logged more hours in the MiG-19 than anyone in the service. Get him." To understand what Victor would find in China, you must first understand how it all began in the golden era of Sino-Soviet relations. When two communist giants stood shoulder to shoulder against the capitalist West, Chairman Mao Zedong had proclaimed the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949. Within months, he traveled to Moscow to meet with Joseph Stalin. The meeting had not been easy. Stalin, suspicious by nature and wary of potential rivals, kept Mao waiting for weeks before agreeing to serious negotiations. But in the end, both leaders recognized that their nations needed each other. The Soviet Union wanted a powerful ally on its eastern flank to counter American influence in the Pacific. China needed Soviet technology to transform itself from a war-devastated agricultural nation into a modern industrial power. They signed the Treaty of Friendship Alliance and Mutual Assistance in February 1950, and with it came something China desperately needed: access to Soviet technology. Throughout the 1950s, thousands of Soviet experts poured into China: engineers who could design factories, scientists who understood metallurgy and chemistry, test pilots who could train Chinese aviators in the latest techniques. They brought blueprints, machinery, and the knowledge to transform a nation. Nowhere was this transformation more evident than in aviation. The Shenyang aircraft factory became the crown jewel of this technological transfer. Located in the industrial heartland of Manchuria, the facility had originally been built by the Japanese during their occupation. Soviet forces had stripped it of equipment during their brief occupation at the end of World War II. But enough infrastructure remained to serve as the foundation for China's aviation ambitions. Here, Chinese workers under Soviet supervision learned the basics of aircraft production. They started with simple tasks: repairing damaged aircraft, assembling planes from Soviet-supplied parts. Slowly, they progressed to more complex work: manufacturing components, then full production of combat aircraft. The first major milestone came with the J-5, China's version of the Soviet MiG-17. When the first fully Chinese-manufactured J-5 flew in July 1956, it marked the moment when China joined the exclusive club of nations capable of producing jet fighters. But even as the J-5 program celebrated its success, Chinese leaders were looking ahead. The MiG-17 was already being superseded in Soviet service by newer, faster aircraft. If China wanted to maintain a credible air defense capability, it would need supersonic fighters. In 1957, China received the most precious gift of all, a license to produce the MiG-19. The MiG-19 was no ordinary aircraft. It represented the absolute cutting edge of Soviet aviation technology. When the prototype first flew in January 1953, it became the first Soviet fighter capable of exceeding the speed of sound and level flight at technological achievement. That placed the Soviet Union at the forefront of supersonic aviation alongside the United States. The aircraft's development had been a response to the Korean War, where American F-86 Sabres had demonstrated that the MiG-15 was reaching its limits. Soviet designers recognized that the next generation would need to be fundamentally different, faster, more powerful, capable of operating at altitudes and speeds the current generation could not reach. The McCoy-Gurevich Design Bureau created a mid-wing fighter with sharply swept wings angled at 55 degrees and twin.
At Tumatsky, RD-9B, afterburning turbojet engines.
Each engine produced 5,732 pounds of thrust dry and 7,165 pounds with afterburner engaged. This gave the MiG-19 a top speed of Mach 1.35 at altitude faster than anything in Soviet service. For China, which had been flying obsolete American-made aircraft during the Civil War just years earlier, the prospect of manufacturing such machines seemed almost unimaginable. According to the licensing agreement, Soviet Union would provide complete manufacturing documentation for the MiG-19P interceptor variant AN. All-weather fighter equipped with radar capable of engaging enemy aircraft in conditions where visual contact was impossible. The documentation included detailed blueprints for every component, from the airframe to the weapon systems to the revolutionary Tumansky engines. Soviet advisors would supervise construction of assembly jigs and tooling at Shenyang. They would train Chinese workers in precise manufacturing techniques. They would remain until China could produce aircraft meeting Soviet quality standards. The first components arrived at Shenyang in early 1958. Soviet engineers supervised construction of specialized jigs. Chinese workers learned the intricate processes of aircraft assembly. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The first MiG-19P, assembled from Soviet-supplied kits, made its maiden flight on December 17, 1958. Test pilot Wu Keming reported that the aircraft handled beautifully. Party officials who witnessed the event were ecstatic. Here was proof that China could manufacture the most advanced Soviet technology. Here was evidence that socialist cooperation could achieve anything. They had no idea how wrong they were. If you're finding this story fascinating, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what happens next is almost unbelievable. The moment when revolutionary politics collided with the laws of physics. And an entire aviation program nearly collapsed overnight. In May 1958, just as the first MiG-19 components were arriving at Shenyang, Mao launched what he called the Great Leap Forward. This ambitious campaign aimed to transform China into a modern industrial nation within just a few years, overtaking Britain and the United States in production. The campaign was built on revolutionary enthusiasm rather than technical reality. Mao believed that the Chinese people, properly motivated by socialist ideology, could accomplish what conventional economics said was impossible. Shenyang, the effects were immediate and devastating. Factory manager Chen Weimin stood before his workers on a sweltering August morning. A red banner unfurled behind him proclaiming "Surpass Britain in 5 years." "Comrades," he announced, "our production quota has been tripled. We will show the world what Chinese workers can accomplish when filled with revolutionary spirit." Senior Soviet advisor, Petrov pulled Chen aside after the meeting. "You're rushing," he said quietly. "The tolerance is on these components. They require precision. You cannot simply—" "Comrade Petrov," Chen interrupted, his voice cold. "We have revolutionary quotas to meet. Physics doesn't care about quotas. Then perhaps physics needs re-education." The careful inspection procedures that Soviet advisors had established were abandoned as too slow, too cautious, too reflective of bourgeois thinking. Workers were told their revolutionary enthusiasm would compensate for lack of technical training. Quality control stations were eliminated to speed up production. The precise Soviet tooling was replaced with locally manufactured substitutes that were far less accurate. Production targets that had seemed ambitious were doubled, then tripled, and what they produced was disaster. The problems were most severe with the engines. The Tumansky RD-9B was a remarkable piece of engineering, but incredibly complex to manufacture. This was the first Soviet turbojet designed entirely domestically, without reliance on captured German technology or British designs. Its development had required years of research and the efforts of the Soviet Union's best engineering minds. Soviet engineers had spent years perfecting the metallurgy of the turbine blades, developing nickel-chromium superalloys containing precise amounts of titanium and aluminum elements that allowed the metal to maintain structural integrity at temperatures exceeding 900 degrees Celsius. They had established tolerances for the compressor stages measured in thousandths of an inch, understanding that even tiny variations could cause catastrophic failures. All of this knowledge had been documented and provided to the Chinese. The technical manuals filled dozens of volumes. The blueprints covered thousands of individual components. But documentation alone was not enough. Building a jet engine requires not just blueprints, but a deep understanding of why each specification exists. It requires skilled machinists who can work to tolerances of 0.001 inches while understanding intuitively when something is not quite right. It requires quality control systems that catch problems before they become catastrophic. And it requires time, the one thing the Great Leap Forward refused to allow. The Chinese copy of the RD-9B was designated the WP-6, and from the very beginning it was troubled. Workers at the Liming engine factory struggled with the precise machining required for compressor blades. Each blade had to be manufactured to exact specifications, with angle and curvature varying precisely along its length. Soviet machinists had developed these techniques over years of practice. Chinese workers, despite their enthusiasm, simply did not have the same level of skill. The special alloys required for the turbine blades were beyond Chinese metallurgical capabilities. Substitutions were made, often without full understanding of their consequences. Chinese metallurgists, working without the exact Soviet formulation, used what they had available. Their blades began showing stress fractures after just 40 hours of operation, and the inspection systems that might have caught these problems were overwhelmed by the pressure to increase production. Quality controllers who rejected too many parts were criticized for being counter-revolutionary, for placing bourgeois concerns about quality above the needs of socialist production. On a gray morning in October 1959, engine number 47 was running at full power on test stand 3 at the Liming factory. Senior technician Liu Wei monitored the gauges, watching the RPM climb toward maximum. The engine had been running for 36 minutes longer than most WP6 South had managed in recent weeks. Perhaps Liu thought they had finally solved the turbine blade problem. At 37 minutes, the turbine shaft snapped. The blade fragments spinning at 12,000 RPM tore through the engine casing like shrapnel from a grenade. Workers dove for cover as metal screamed against metal, sparks showering across the concrete floor. A chunk of turbine blade punched through the test stand's protective barrier and embedded itself in the wall 3 inches from where Liu had been standing moments before. When the smoke cleared, engine number 47 was scrap. It had lasted 37 minutes. The Soviet RD-9B, it was copied from routinely operated for 300 hours between overhauls. Liu stood in the silence that followed, staring at the destroyed engine. Somewhere behind him, a party official was already composing the report that would blame saboteurs for the failure. But Liu knew the truth. They all did. The results across the program were devastating. Pilots who flew the early J-6 South reported strange vibrations that had never been present in Soviet-built aircraft. They experienced unexplained power losses during critical phases of flight. They noticed handling characteristics that differed dramatically from the aircraft they had trained on. Some reported that their aircraft felt subtly wrong, as if the controls were not quite connected to the surfaces they commanded. Lieutenant Chen Bo was at 30,000 feet over Manchuria when his left engine quit without warning. No gradual decline, no instrument indication. One moment he had power, the next he was flying a 7-ton glider. He nursed the J-6 back on one engine, the aircraft wallowing and threatening to stall with every gust of wind. He landed with fuel for perhaps 2 more minutes of flight, his hands shaking so badly he could barely complete the post-flight checklist. In his debrief, Chen said 5 words that would be echoed by dozens of pilots in the months to come. "I will not fly again." By 1960, the situation had become critical. The People's Liberation Army Air Force was refusing to accept aircraft from Shenyang. Not a single qualified aircraft or engine had been delivered since production began in earnest. The rejection rate exceeded 90%. The factory was producing machines that looked like fighters but could not safely fly. The first overhaul life of the WP-6 engine was set at just 100 hours, roughly 100 combat sorties. This meant the entire engine would need complete disassembly, inspection, and rebuilding after barely a month of operational use. Even that 100-hour limit proved optimistic for many early WP-6 engines. The Soviet RD-9B, while not known for exceptional reliability by Western standards, could operate for 300 hours between overhauls. The difference was a direct measure of manufacturing quality. And then came the break with Moscow. The Sino-Soviet split had been building for years, fueled by ideological differences and personal animosity between Khrushchev and Mao. Mao believed Khrushchev's policy of peaceful coexistence with the West represented a betrayal of revolutionary principles. Khrushchev thought Mao's aggressive rhetoric was reckless and dangerous. The tensions had begun after Stalin's death in 1953, when Khrushchev delivered his secret speech criticizing Stalin's excesses. This created problems for Mao, who had modeled many of his own policies on Stalin's example. But when the final break came, it came with devastating speed. On July 16, 1960, Moscow announced that all Soviet advisors and experts in China would be withdrawn. Within weeks, approximately 1,400 Soviet personnel left the country, taking with them not just their expertise but crucial technical documentation for projects still in development. The withdrawal was deliberately punishing. Soviet advisors were instructed to pack everything, including documents that had already been shared with Chinese counterparts. Some tore pages from technical manuals, ensuring incomplete information remained. On July 20, 1960, Yuri Petrov packed his bags at the Shenyang guest house. 3 years of work, 3 years of building relationships with Chinese colleagues who had become friends, all of it, ending with a telegram from Moscow, and 48 hours to leave. Liu Wei stood in the doorway, watching Petrov fold his clothes with mechanical precision. They had worked together since 1958, had shared meals and vodka and arguments about the proper way to machine a compressor blade. "The procedures," Liu said quietly. "But you never gave us the complete manufacturing procedures." "The documentation for the heat treatment process." Petrov paused, a shirt half folded in his hands. "I know. Can you?" "Before you go," Petrov met Liu's eyes. He wanted to help. He genuinely liked Liu, respected his intelligence and determination. The young engineer reminded Petrov of himself 20 years ago, burning with ambition to build something great. But his orders were explicit. Withdrawal was to be complete. Nothing left behind that could help the Chinese continue. "I'm sorry," Petrov said, and he was. He knew what would happen next. Without the manufacturing procedures, without the metallurgical specifications that had never been fully delivered, the Chinese would be building engines blind. They would struggle for years, perhaps decades, to solve problems that Soviet engineers had already solved. Liu nodded slowly. "I understand." But understanding changed nothing. When Petrov's car pulled away from the guest house that afternoon, Liu stood watching until it disappeared around the corner. Then he walked back to the factory, to the half-finished engines and incomplete blueprints, and began the long work of figuring out what the Soviets had never told them. At Shenyang, the departure of Soviet advisors left chaos. There were blueprints, yes, but many of the process specifications that explained how to translate those blueprints into actual aircraft had never been fully delivered. The Soviet side, for reasons that remain debated to this day, had been unable to provide detailed manufacturing procedures at the same time as structural drawings. The Chinese, confident in their abilities, had decided they could write their own procedures. That confidence proved disastrously misplaced. Every assembly jig in the factory was discarded. Every manufacturing process was reviewed and revised. Production was completely halted while engineers worked to understand what had gone wrong. In a humiliating reversal, China requested new technical assistance through back channels, away from public pronouncements of ideological struggle. Despite political tensions, a trickle of support continued into the early 1960s. Both sides recognized that a complete collapse of Chinese aviation capability would serve neither's interests. New jigs were manufactured to exact Soviet specifications rather than Chinese approximations. New quality control procedures were implemented with inspection stages at every critical point. New training programs taught workers the precise techniques Soviet machinists had developed over years of experience. Slowly, painfully, the J-6 program began to recover. Which brings us back to Victor Vulkoff and his classified mission to evaluate exactly what China had managed to accomplish. Victor arrived in China on a gray March morning, traveling undercover as part of a technical advisory team, a gesture of continued socialist cooperation during a period of strained relations. Reality. He carried orders signed by General Sokolov himself: evaluate the Chinese J-6 and report honestly on its capabilities. The airfield in northeastern China was remote, surrounded by hills that caught the last of winter's snow. Victor stood on the tarmac, breath forming small clouds in the crisp air, and studied the aircraft before him. It looked exactly like the MiG-19 he had flown thousands of hours back home. The same swept wings angled at precisely 55 degrees. The same twin-engine configuration. The same distinctive nose intake that had made the Farmer, as NATO called it, the first Soviet supersonic fighter to enter mass production. But Victor knew better than to trust appearances. He walked around the aircraft with the practiced eye of a test pilot who had evaluated dozens of variants throughout his career. He ran his gloved hand along the fuselage, feeling the aluminum skin beneath his fingertips. The paint job was good. The riveting appeared solid, the rows of fasteners marching in straight lines along the panels. He crouched beneath the wing, examining the hardpoints where bombs or rocket pods could be attached. The Chinese had maintained the same configuration as the Soviet original 4 pylons, capable of carrying up to 500 kilograms of external stores. The wing surface showed good finish, smooth and free of the ripples that would indicate poor manufacturing. From the outside, this J-6 looked every bit as capable as the MiG-19s he had left behind at his base near Moscow. But Victor knew the history. He knew about the chaos that had consumed Chinese aviation during the Great Leap Forward. He knew about the frantic attempts to manufacture aircraft without proper tooling, without proper training, without proper quality control. Victor climbed the ladder and settled into the ejection seat. The cockpit was familiar, almost identical to the MiG-19S he knew so well. Airspeed indicator, altimeter, attitude indicator, engine gauges arrayed in the standard Soviet pattern. Controls fell readily to hand. The Chinese had made few modifications to the basic cockpit design, which was both reassuring and telling. They had simply tried to copy it exactly, and even that had proven challenging enough. He went through pre-flight checks methodically, testing each system as Soviet training had taught him. He verified flight controls, moving the stick through its full range and watching the surfaces respond. He checked instruments, tapping their faces to ensure the needles moved freely. He tested the radio, receiving acknowledgement from the tower. The Chinese ground crew watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety. They had worked hard to prepare this aircraft for evaluation, knowing their work would be judged by standards far more demanding than any they had faced before. When Victor was satisfied, he signaled to the ground crew. A portable power unit was connected, and he initiated the engine start sequence. The left engine turned over, coughed, and caught. Then the right. The familiar whine of turbine engines spooling up filled the cockpit. But as he brought the engines to life, Victor frowned. The sound was wrong. He had spent years listening to RD-9B engines. He knew their voice the way a parent knows their child's cry, the way a mechanic knows the sound of a properly tuned car. The turbines should produce a clean, steady whine that rises to a distinctive roar as they approach full power. What he heard from the WP6 engines behind him was subtly different. There was a roughness, almost like a car engine that needed tuning. A hint of vibration in frequencies that should have been absent. When he pushed the throttles forward to check response, there was a barely perceptible hesitation before the power came on. To a casual observer, it might have seemed like nothing. The engines were running, producing power. The gauges showed readings within normal parameters. But Victor was no casual observer. He'd been chosen for this mission precisely because of his exceptional sensitivity to aircraft behavior. His ability to detect problems that instruments could not measure. What he was sensing told him that these engines, though they might produce required thrust numbers on a test stand, were not the equal of their Soviet ancestors. Victor taxied to the runway and received clearance from the tower. He pushed the throttles to military power and felt the familiar pressure pushing him back into his seat. The J-6 accelerated down the runway. The engine noise was loud in the cockpit, louder than he remembered from his Mi-19 flights. Rotation speed came, and he pulled back on the stick. The aircraft lifted smoothly, wings biting into the air with the authority that swept-wing fighters possess. The landing gear retracted with a solid thump, and Victor configured for climb. For a moment, he allowed himself to hope. Climb was normal. The aircraft handled well enough, responding to his inputs with reasonable precision. The instruments showed what they should. Perhaps the Chinese had solved their quality problems after all. Then Victor lit the afterburners. On a properly functioning MiG-19, afterburner ignition should be smooth and progressive. The pilot pushes the throttle past the detent. Fuel is injected into hot exhaust gases behind the turbine. Thrust increases dramatically as that fuel ignites. There might be a slight kick as extra power comes on, but the transition should be controlled, predictable. What Victor experienced was different. A pronounced shudder tore through the airframe as the afterburners ignited, a moment of instability that sent vibrations through every surface. He felt the aircraft trying to yaw, to twist in response to uneven thrust. The power, when it came, was uneven between the two engines, demanding constant correction. And the engine note, which should have been a thunderous roar of controlled power, had an underlying roughness that set Victor's teeth on edge. It was the sound of combustion that was not quite right, of fuel and air mixing in proportions, close to optimal, but not exactly there. He reduced power, and the roughness subsided. But the damage to his assessment was done. These engines might work, but they were nowhere near the level of refinement that Soviet manufacturing had achieved. Over the next 90 minutes, Victor put the J-6 through its paces. He tested handling at various altitudes from low-level flight among the hills to the thin air at 40,000 feet. He evaluated performance at different speeds, from minimum controllable airspeed to maximum velocity. With each test, his mental notebook grew fuller with concerns. The roll rate was slightly slower than a properly maintained MiG-19. When he commanded a rapid roll, the aircraft responded, but there was a lag, perhaps 0.3 seconds, that a combat pilot would notice in the heat of battle. Something in the linkage or surface construction was introducing friction that reduced responsiveness. The turn performance was adequate but not crisp. Victor felt the aircraft protesting slightly as he pulled G-forces in tight turns. The wings not quite rigid enough to maintain optimal shape under load. This was likely a manufacturing issue in wing structure, though without detailed inspection, he could not be certain. The hydraulic system had minor inconsistencies affecting control feel. Sometimes the stick moved with smooth precision. Other times there was stickiness, a sensation of resistance that came and went unpredictably, and always underlying everything. There was that roughness from the Enginsa, constant reminder that he was not flying a Soviet-built MiG-19. Victor performed basic combat maneuvers that any fighter pilot would need in battle. He engaged imaginary enemies, pushing the aircraft through sequences of turns and rolls. The J-6 could perform these maneuvers, but it did so with reluctance that would prove troubling in actual combat. He tested the radar, the feature that distinguished the MiG-19P from other variants. The set appeared to function within basic parameters. He could detect ground returns and distinguish terrain features, but tracking an airborne target would require further testing. When Victor landed and shut down the engines, he sat in the cockpit for a long moment, composing his thoughts. The Chinese officers would be waiting for his assessment. They deserved the truth. But the truth would not be easy to hear. He climbed down from the cockpit and was immediately approached by the officers who had arranged this evaluation. Their faces showed hope and apprehension. They had worked hard to recover from the disasters of the Great Leap Forward. They had rebuilt production processes from scratch. Victor chose his words carefully. He was a pilot, not a diplomat, but he understood that what he said would have consequences beyond this airfield. The aircraft is functional, he said. Colonel Zhang, the senior Chinese officer, leaned forward. Functional. It can fly, it could fight, it could serve as a useful addition to your air defense forces. Victor paused. But the engines? Yes. They're copying our homework, Colonel. But they don't understand the math. He explained what he had found. The engine roughness, the minor handling deficiencies, the overall sense that the aircraft was a good but imperfect copy. The WP-6 power plants were the heart of the problem. They produced thrust within acceptable parameters, but with none of the refinement that Soviet engineering had achieved. They would require more maintenance. They would have shorter operational lives. They would give pilots that slightly unsettling feeling that something was not quite right, a distraction that could prove fatal in combat. Victor's report, when it made its way back to Moscow through classified channels, confirmed what Soviet intelligence had suspected. China had managed to create an indigenous aviation industry, but quality remained significantly below Soviet standards. The Great Leap Forward had set the program back years. Even now, with new tooling and better procedures, fundamental challenges of precision manufacturing remained. The irony was not lost on anyone in Moscow who read the report. The RD-9B engine that China was struggling to copy was itself a 1950s one the Soviet Union had long since moved beyond. While Chinese factories labored to produce acceptable WP-6 engines, Soviet factories were manufacturing the far more advanced Tumansky R-11 for the MiG-21. The technology gap, rather than closing, was actually widening. General Sokolov finished reading Victor's assessment and set it down on his desk. Perhaps 10. At least, Victor agreed. Though I would not underestimate their determination, General. Determination? Sokolov lit a cigarette. Determination doesn't machine turbine blades to 0.001-inch tolerances? No, sir. But it keeps them trying until they learn how. For China, Victor's assessment, though they would never see it directly, represented a reality they already knew. Quality problems with the J-6 program became a defining lesson in the importance of systematic manufacturing processes. The shortcuts of the Great Leap Forward had cost years of progress and untold resources. The path forward would require patience, precision, and willingness to learn from failure. The J-6 would eventually become the most produced Chinese fighter of its era. With over 4,000 aircraft manufactured between 1958 and 1981, but it would carry the stigma of its troubled birth throughout its long career. Chinese doctrine called for the J-6 to operate for just 100 flight hours before requiring major overhaul, roughly equivalent to 100 combat sorties. The aircraft were essentially expected to be used up and discarded rather than maintained for long service lives. The Pakistan Air Force, which received F-6 export versions, found that with diligent maintenance they could extend this to perhaps 130 hours. But even this represented a fundamental difference from Western and Soviet aircraft, which routinely operated for thousands of hours between major overhauls. The reliability issues persisted throughout the J-6's career despite continuous improvement efforts. In the early 1970s, fractures of turbine shafts during operation began occurring in WP-6 engines at both Shenyang and Chengdu factories. Investigation revealed insufficient residual strength, a problem the Soviet RD-9B had never suffered. The problem lay not in the concept but in the execution. Chinese metallurgy, machining tolerances, and quality control had introduced weaknesses that did not exist in the Soviet original. The Ministry of Aviation Industry held a special meeting in 1977 to analyze these failures. The conclusion was sobering. Despite nearly 2 decades of effort, Chinese engine manufacturing still had not matched Soviet standards from the 1950s. Engineers carried out 3 major cycles of shaft modification design, test piece production, and fatigue tests. Substantial progress was made in each cycle, but the work was slow and painstaking. There was no shortcut to reliability. The J-6 would eventually prove itself in combat, despite its limitations. The 925th Fighter Regiment of the North Vietnamese People's Air Force was established in early 1969 specifically to operate J-6 South provided by China, while North Vietnam's MiG-17s and MiG-21s came from the Soviet Union. The MiG-19s were exclusively Chinese. The J-6's combat record was mixed, but included notable successes. Its powerful 30mm cannons copied from the Soviet NR-30 proved devastating against slower aircraft and ground targets. Its excellent maneuverability at subsonic speeds allowed it to engage more advanced American fighters in close combat. Its simplicity meant it could operate from primitive airfields with minimal support. But the engine issues never fully disappeared. Pilots who flew the J-6 throughout its career reported that they never quite trusted the WP-6 power plants the way they trusted Soviet-built engines. There was always that underlying roughness, that sense of manufacturing compromises built into every component. When the last J-6 South were finally retired from Chinese service in the 2000s, they represented the end of an era. The aircraft that had taught China painful lessons of precision manufacturing were gone, replaced by far more capable indigenous designs that owed their existence partly to those early struggles. Some retired J-6 airframes found new life as unmanned drones converted to serve as targets or decoys. It was a fitting end for aircraft that had always been considered disposable. The legacy of the J-6 program extends beyond manufacturing lessons. It taught an entire generation of Chinese aerospace professionals that excellence cannot be rushed, that quality cannot be compromised, and that the pursuit of advanced technology requires patience measured in decades rather than months. The engineers who struggled with early WP-6 engines went on to train the engineers who'd finally mastered jet engine production. The pilots who flew temperamental aircraft passed their hard-won knowledge to aviators who would eventually fly world-class Chinese fighters. The factory workers who learned to achieve precision established the manufacturing culture that produces today's advanced systems. What Victor Vulkoff could not have known in 1963 was how much his assessment would change over the following decades. The J-6, for all its flaws, represented China's first steps toward aviation independence. The lessons learned from its troubled development would inform everything that came after. The same factories that produced those flawed J-6 South would eventually manufacture fighters that could compete with the best in the world. The difficulties with the WP-6 taught Chinese engineers that jet engine manufacturing was far more challenging than they had initially appreciated. The precision required, the material science involved, the intricate understanding of aerodynamics and thermodynamics needed to make a reliable power plant all went far beyond simply following blueprints. These lessons proved valuable as China developed indigenous designs. The J-7, based on the MiG-21, faced similar challenges with its WP-7 engine. The far more ambitious programs that would eventually produce the J-10 and J-20 fighters required China to finally master the engine technologies that had proven so elusive with the WP-6. Every nation that has achieved aerospace excellence has traveled a similar path. The United States struggled with unreliable engines in the early days of the jet age. The Soviet Union learned hard lessons from early fighter programs that killed many brave pilots. Britain, France, and Germany all faced setbacks on their journeys to aerospace capability. What made the J-6 story unique was the scale of the challenge China faced and the dramatic nature of its initial failure, the Great Leap. Forward was not merely a setback, it was a near-total collapse of quality standards that could have destroyed China's aerospace ambitions entirely. That the program recovered at all was remarkable. That it eventually produced a capable, widely exported fighter was extraordinary. The Q-5 ground attack aircraft, developed from the J-6 airframe, would become one of China's most successful military aircraft exports. The engineering knowledge gained from both programs informed everything that came after. Each problem identified became a goal to overcome. Each failure became a lesson to learn. Each gap between Chinese capability and Soviet technology became a challenge to close. Liu Wei, the young engineer who had watched Yuri Petrov drive away in 1960, would spend the next 3 decades solving the problems the Soviets had left behind. In the months after the withdrawal, he worked 18-hour days, poring over the incomplete documentation, running tests, analyzing failures. He and his colleagues developed their own heat treatment processes through trial and error, hundreds of experiments to discover what the Soviets had known and never shared. By 1965, Liu had been promoted to chief engineer of the WP-6 program. The engines his team produced were better than those of the Great Leap Forward years, but still not equal to the Soviet original. The 100-hour overhaul life remained stubbornly fixed, a constant reminder of how far they had to go. "We are climbing a mountain in the dark," Liu told his team during a particularly difficult period. "We cannot see the summit. We do not know how far we have come, but we know that every step upward is progress." In 1977, when turbine shaft fractures threatened to ground the entire J-6 fleet, It was Liu's team that developed the solution, a modified shaft design with improved stress distribution that doubled the time between failures. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a Chinese solution, developed without Soviet help. Liu retired in 1992. Having spent his entire career working on engines that never quite matched their Soviet ancestors, but by then, a new generation of engineers, many of them his former students, were developing turbofan engines for aircraft that Yuri Petrov could never have imagined. At Liu's retirement ceremony, one of his former students presented him with a small gift, a turbine blade from an early WP6 engine, one that had cracked after just 40 hours of operation. It was mounted on a wooden base with a simple inscription, "Where we began." Liu kept it on his desk until the day he died. The story of the J-6 must be understood within the broader context of Cold War aviation development. In 1963, when Victor Vulkoff evaluated the Chinese fighter, the global aviation landscape was undergoing rapid transformation. The Soviet Union had already moved beyond the MiG-19 to the MiG-21, a true Mach-2 fighter that would become one of the most produced jet aircraft in history. The United States was fielding the F-4 Phantom, a massive twin-engine fighter that could reach speeds of Mach 2.2 and carry an arsenal of missiles. Against this backdrop, China's struggle to copy a 1950s design seemed almost quaint. The technology gap was not shrinking, it was growing wider with each passing year. But what outside observers failed to appreciate was the foundation being laid. The factories producing flawed J-6s were also training workers in the basics of aerospace manufacturing. The engineers struggling with WP6 engines were learning the fundamental principles of jet propulsion. The pilots flying temperamental aircraft were developing the institutional knowledge that would eventually produce one of the world's largest air forces. The Soviet Union, by withdrawing its advisors, had inadvertently given China a gift: the necessity of self-reliance. Without Soviet help, China had no choice but to develop its own capabilities. The process was painful and slow, but it produced something that licensed production never could have: genuine understanding. When you build something yourself, you learn in ways that copying never allows. You understand not just what works, but why it works. You develop intuition for problems before they become catastrophic. You build institutional knowledge that can be passed to the next generation. The J-6 program, troubled as it was, became a school for an entire industry. While China struggled with the J-6, other nations faced similar challenges in developing indigenous aviation capabilities. India, which had also received Soviet assistance, encountered many of the same problems when attempting to manufacture the MiG-21 under license. The HAL facility at Nasik struggled with quality control issues that would persist for decades. Indian-built MiG-21s gained a reputation for unreliability that would haunt the program throughout its service life. Israel, starting from scratch, built an aerospace industry through sheer determination and necessity. The Israelis learned the same lessons China was learning: that there are no shortcuts to excellence, that every component must be manufactured to exact specifications, that quality control is not optional. Even established aerospace powers faced setbacks. France's Mirage 3, one of the most successful European fighters of the era, went through years of development problems before reaching operational capability. Britain's aviation industry, despite decades of experience, produced several notable failures alongside its successes. The difference was that these nations had decades of industrial experience to draw upon. China was attempting to leapfrog from agricultural society to aerospace power in a single generation. The ambition was remarkable. The difficulties were inevitable. The story of the J-6 program is also a story of human sacrifice. Precise numbers are difficult to obtain, but Chinese sources acknowledge that numerous test pilots lost their lives during the development and early operational phases of the program. Engine failures, structural problems, and handling issues claimed an unknown toll. Captain Zheng Yongjin was one of them. In 1962, during a test flight of an early production J-6, his left engine exploded at 25,000 feet. The turbine shaft failure, the same problem that would plague the WP-6-4. Decades sent fragments through the fuselage, severing hydraulic lines and damaging the flight controls. Zhang managed to transmit a brief radio message before the aircraft became uncontrollable. His wingman watched the J-6 enter a flat spin from which recovery was impossible. Zhang ejected at low altitude, but his parachute did not fully deploy. He was 27 years old. His sacrifice, and the sacrifices of others like him, were not forgotten. When the turbine shaft's problem was finally solved in the late 1970s, the solution was named in honor of the pilots who had died because of the defect. It was a small tribute, but it acknowledged that the J-6's path to reliability had been paved with human lives. The WP-6 engine evolved continuously throughout its production life, though it never fully matched the Soviet original. The WP-6A, introduced in 1963, incorporated improved turbine blades with better heat resistance. The overhaul life increased to 150 hours, still far short of Soviet standards, but a significant improvement. The WP-6B, which appeared in 1970, featured redesigned compressor stages that improved efficiency and reduced the characteristic roughness that Victor Vulkoff had noticed. Pilots reported that the newer engines felt smoother, more refined, though still not quite equal to Soviet power plants. The WP-6C, the final major variant, incorporated the shaft modifications developed in response to the 1970s failures. By this point, Chinese engineers had developed a deep understanding of the engine's characteristics, an understanding that came not from Soviet documentation, but from decades of operational experience. Each variant represented incremental progress. None represented a breakthrough. The fundamental limitations of the design limitations that the Soviets had accepted in the 1950s could not be overcome without a complete redesign. But the knowledge gained from each variant fed into new programs. The WP-7, which powered the J-7 China's version of the MiG-21, benefited from lessons learned with the WP-6, the WP-13. A more advanced turbojet developed for upgraded J-7 variants, incorporated technologies that would have been impossible without the foundation laid by the WP-6 program. Despite its limitations, the J-6 became a significant export success. Pakistan received its first F-6 aircraft in 1966 and would eventually operate hundreds of the type. Pakistani pilots, initially skeptical of the Chinese fighter, came to appreciate its ruggedness and maneuverability. During the 1971 war with India, Pakistani F-6 South engaged Indian aircraft in several dogfights, claiming kills against both Hunters and Su-7 South. Egypt operated the aircraft during the tensions preceding the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Albania, isolated from both Soviet and Western suppliers, relied on Chinese J-6 South for air defense throughout the Cold War. Bangladesh, North Korea, Somalia, Sudan, Tanzania, and numerous other nations added the type to their inventories. For many of these countries, the J-6 was their first supersonic fighter. It was affordable, relatively simple to maintain, and backed by Chinese technical support that often proved more accessible than Soviet or Western alternatives. The export sales provided valuable foreign currency and, equally important, gave Chinese aerospace industry experience in supporting overseas operations. Managing supply chains, training foreign personnel, adapting aircraft to different operational environments, these skills would prove invaluable as China developed more advanced aircraft for export. Victor Vulkoff returned to Moscow with his assessment complete. He had done what he was sent to do, provide accurate intelligence about Chinese aviation capabilities. The aircraft he had flown was adequate, but not impressive, a copy that failed to match its original. He recommended continued monitoring of Chinese development, noting that if China could not yet match 1950s Soviet technology, they certainly posed no threat of surpassing it any time soon. He was right about the present. He could not have imagined the future. Today, when military analysts study Chinese aviation capabilities, they see a nation that has traveled an extraordinary distance from those early struggles with the J-6. The same country that could not produce a reliable copy of a 1950s Soviet engine now develops cutting-edge power plants for stealth fighters. The same factories that turned out flawed aircraft during the Great Leap Forward now manufacture some of the world's most sophisticated combat systems. The J-20, China's fifth-generation stealth fighter, represents capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction to Victor Vulkoff and his contemporaries. The transformation did not happen overnight, and it did not happen easily. It required decades of patient work, countless failures, and a willingness to learn from every mistake. The J-6 program, with all its troubles, was the painful first chapter in the story of aerospace development. The WP-6 engine, that imperfect copy of the Tumansky RD-9B, remains a symbol of this complex legacy.
Oh.
It was never quite as good as the Soviet original. It required more maintenance, failed more often, and gave pilots constant reminders of its manufacturing compromises. But it worked. It was Chinese, and it taught lessons that no amount of Soviet technical assistance could have provided. When you understand why something fails, you understand something profound about how to make it succeed. The engineers who struggled with the WP-6 learned to think about metallurgy, about tolerances, about quality control, in ways that engineers who simply follow instructions never do. They developed an intuition for jet engine design that would prove invaluable in later decades. Victor Vulkoff continued his career as a test pilot until 1975, when advancing age and accumulated flight hours forced him into a desk job. He spent his final working years training young pilots, passing on the knowledge he had accumulated over decades of flight. He never spoke publicly about his 1963 mission to China. The operation remained classified throughout his lifetime. But colleagues noticed that he followed news of Chinese aviation development with unusual interest, collecting reports and analysis with the attention of someone personally invested in the outcome. In 1999, when news reached him that China had developed the J-10, a fully indigenous fighter comparable to Western, fourth-generation aircraft, Victor is said to have smiled and raised a glass of vodka in silent salute. "I told Sokolov not to underestimate their determination," he reportedly said to his wife. "It just took longer than I expected." Victor Vulkoff died in 2003 at the age of 78. He never saw the J-20 fly. We'll never witness China's emergence as a true aerospace superpower. But he had been there at the beginning, when a young nation's ambitions exceeded its capabilities. And he had recognized something that many of his colleagues missed. The rough-running engines he heard that day in 1963 were not just the sound of manufacturing failure. They were the sound of a nation learning to fly. The story of the J-6 offers lessons that remain relevant today, as nations around the world attempt to develop advanced aviation capabilities. First, there are no shortcuts to aerospace excellence. The Great Leap Forward's attempt to substitute revolutionary enthusiasm for technical precision resulted in catastrophic failure. Physics does not respond to political pressure. Metallurgy does not improve because of ideology. The laws of aerodynamics apply equally to socialist and capitalist aircraft. Second, copying technology is far more difficult than it appears. Having blueprints is not the same as having capability. The Soviet Union provided comprehensive documentation for the MiG-19, yet China struggled for decades to match the original's quality. True capability comes not from documents, but from deep understanding that can only be developed through experience. Third, failure is the foundation of success. Every crashed aircraft, every failed engine, every rejected component taught Chinese engineers something valuable. The J-6 program's troubles, painful as they were, created the institutional knowledge that would eventually produce world-class aerospace capabilities. Fourth, patience is essential. China's transformation from a nation that could not copy a 1950s engine to one that designed stealth fighters took 60 years. There were no breakthroughs, no shortcuts, no revolutionary leaps, just steady, patient improvement, year after year, decade after decade. Finally, determination matters more than starting position. In 1963, China was decades behind the Soviet Union in aerospace technology. Today, China challenges the most advanced nations in aviation capability. The difference was not resources or talent. The Soviet Union had both in abundance. The difference was determination, an unwavering commitment to improvement that persisted through failure after failure after failure. 60 years later, Chinese J-20 stealth fighters patrol the skies with engines designed entirely in China. The same factories that couldn't copy a 1950s Soviet turbine now build power plants rivaling anything in the world. The same nation that struggled to manufacture acceptable copies now exports advanced fighters to countries around the globe. The rough-running WP-6 engines that troubled Victor Vulkoff were not just manufacturing defects. They were the growing pains of a nation learning to fly. Every failed turbine blade was a lesson to be learned. Every rejected engine was knowledge gained. Every pilot who landed with his heart pounding was proof that China would not give up. When Soviet pilots tested China's J-6, they found an engine worse than their 1950s original. That finding was accurate, was honest. And it was, in its way, exactly what China needed to hear. Because sometimes the most valuable thing you can receive is the truth about your failures. That truth, painful as it is, becomes the foundation upon which real progress can be built. China took that truth and built an industry. The J-6, flawed as it was, became a teacher for generations of engineers. The WP-6 engine, imperfect as it was, became a classroom for understanding jet propulsion. And the lessons learned, painful as they were, became the foundation for achievements that would have seemed impossible in 1963. The Soviet pilots who tested the J-6 did China a service by being honest about what they found. Their assessment was critical, but it was accurate. And accuracy, even when it stings, is the only foundation upon which real progress can be built. When Soviet pilots tested China's J-6, they found an engine worse than their 1950s original. What they couldn't know was that they'd also found something far more valuable, a nation that would never stop trying to do better. And in the world of aerospace, that determination is the most powerful engine of all.